Years ago, I was given some language by a pastor and author named Andy Stanley that was super helpful in my own relationships. And it's something that I've shared with hundreds of people in different situations over the last decade or two. And it's this idea that there's always a gap that gets created between what we expect to happen and then what actually happens. And so let's say that you expect that someone's going to get home at 3 p.m. because they told you, you know what, I'm going to be home at 3 p.m. But what actually happened is they got home at 4:30 p.m. And so there's a gap between what you expected to happen and what actually happened. Maybe someone said, you know what, hey, I'm going to make sure that I pay that bill on time. And that's what you expected to happen. Someone said they were going to pay the bill, but then you discover that what actually happened was that it was a week and a half late. So there was a gap between what you expected to happen, what actually happened. Maybe you said, you know what, I expected the trash was going to get taken out and the dishes were going to get washed by the time I get home because my teenager told me when I said, hey, would you do this by the time I get home? And they said yes. And so I expected that. But when I got home, they weren't done. And so there's a gap between what I expected to happen and what actually happened. And so the key to so many healthy relationships is what you and I choose to put in that gap. There's a gap. And you and I, we have control of what gets put into that gap. And the relationships that prove, and there's been lots of articles on this, lots of research that's been done on this in different studies, relationships that are the strongest and the ones that persevere through difficulty are the ones typically that have learned to put the most generous explanation possible in that gap. Because you and I, we think, oh, well, I didn't create that gap. Someone else created that gap. They didn't do this. They didn't do this. They didn't do this. But what you and I, when there's a gap created that we're experiencing, you and I, we have the ability to decide what goes in that gap. And the key to healthy relationships oftentimes is that we become people who pre-decide that we are going to put the most generous explanation in the gap possible. Whenever a gap is created, that we're going to pre-decide, I'm going to try to put the most generous explanation in that gap for why someone was late, why it didn't get done. Something must have come up. You know what? I'm sure they ran into traffic, or I bet they got walked out and somebody, caught them in the parking lot and they had a long discussion. Something came up. I'm sure they got distracted by something else, maybe a phone call with a friend. Maybe they were working on something else and they just got distracted. That's why the dishes weren't done. Whatever it is, that we try to come up with the most generous explanation possible. Now, the difficulty is that many times we don't put the most generous explanation in the gap. What we end up choosing is suspicion. We put the worst possible scenario explanation in the gap. I can't believe they're just so rude. They're so inconsiderate. I can't believe they're treating me like they think I'm the maid around here and that I'm just supposed to do everything. They can just ignore me, that they don't respect me. They don't actually want to be home. They're probably off, stopping off in some other places and they're just lying to me about why they're late and something else is going on, or they're cheating on me or having an affair, or who knows, whatever the worst possible explanation is that we can come up with in our head. And many times what we do is we put suspicion in the gap. And what we have to realize is that when we communicate suspicion and when we put suspicion in the gap, how all of us receive suspicion is we receive suspicion as rejection. So when we put suspicion in the gap, what we're doing is we're communicating, I don't trust you. What we're communicating is rejection. And the thing is, all of us, we run from rejection. None of us like feeling rejected, so we run from it. And the last thing anyone ever wants to do to someone that they love is to make them feel like that they've disappointed them. No one wants to feel like a disappointment. No one wants to experience rejection. And so many times in this gap that gets created, we have to remember that what we choose to put in that gap matters. Now, you might say, okay, well, what happens when I've kept putting this generous explanation in the gap over and over and over again? What do I do then? Because the same thing keeps happening. Well, when it gets to that point, the thing is, what you and I have to do is we have to actually ask the question. We actually have to confront. And the thing is, we just don't do that very well. Many of us just don't confront. What we do is we let that suspicion and the gap just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and grow and grow and grow. And we'll let these stories go inside of our head about what actually is happening and what we think is happening and what people's intentions are, their motivations are. And so what we have to learn to do is saying, okay, when I can no longer put a generous explanation in the gap, and I might have very valid reasons for why I can't do that, I have to confront. I have to ask the question. And how we ask that question is really important, because we lead with this attempt to saying, I'm trying to put a generous explanation in the gap. So it can be like, hey, listen, I'm sure there's a good explanation here, but you know what? I need to ask you, because this is like the 4th time this has happened. And rather than let these stories kind of flood in my head and I can get, my mind can go racing about what I think is happening. So rather than let that just go on and on and on, I just want to ask. I just want to ask for an explanation of what happened between this and this. And now some of you are going, you know what? Okay, I'm not really good at confrontation. Like, I just don't really like confrontation. Here's something good for us to always remember. If you're someone who loves confrontation, you're probably not very good at it, right? The fact that you don't love it probably means that you're better at it. It's not something you want to love doing. And so, when in any of our relationships, whether that's with a partner, whether that's with a spouse, whether that's with a teenager or a child, that if we can get in the habit of saying, here's what I expected to happen, here's what actually happened, and we remind ourselves, we choose what goes in that gap. We choose whether we put a generous explanation in that gap or whether we put suspicion in that gap. And we have to recognize when we continue to put suspicion, what that does to relationships. That communicates rejection, which means relationships grow farther and farther apart. And then when we can't put a generous explanation in the gap, when it becomes too apparent that we can't keep doing that, that we would be naive to keep doing that, we have to ask, we have to confront. But we do it in such a way that it leads with fighting for trying to put the best explanation in the gap. I'm assuming there's a good explanation. I'm wanting to trust you. I'm fighting really hard to trust you, but I need to ask this question. And so here's to being people who learn to put generous explanations in the gap.